Arthur C. Clarke, Childhood's End. Chapter 3. Stormgren was sleeping badly these nights, which was strange since he soon would be putting aside the cares of office forever. He had served mankind for 40 years, and its master for 5, and few men could look back upon a life that had seen so many of its ambitions achieved. Perhaps that was the trouble. In the years of retirement, however many they might be, he would have no further goals to give him any zest to life. Since Martha had died and the children had established their own families, his ties with the world seemed to have weakened. It might be, too, that he was beginning to identify himself with the overlords, and thus to become detached from humanity. This was another one of those restless nights when his brain went on turning like a machine, whose governor had failed. He knew better than to woo sleep any further, and reluctantly climbed out of bed. Throwing on his dressing gown, he strolled onto the roof garden of his modest flat. There was not one of his direct subordinates who did not possess much of the more luxurious apartment, but this place was ample for Stormgren's needs. He had reached the position where neither personal possessions nor official ceremony could add anything to his stature. The night was warm, almost oppressive, but the sky was clear, and a brilliant moon hung low in the southwest. 10 kilometers away, the night lights of New York glowed on the skyline like a dawn frozen in the act of breaking. Stormgren raised his eyes above the sleeping city, climbing again to the heights that he alone of living men had scaled. Far away it was, he could see the hull of Corellan's ship, glinting in the moonlight. He wondered what the supervisor was doing, for he did not believe that the overlords ever slept. High above, a meteor thrust its shining spear through the dome of the sky. The luminous trail glowed faintly for a while, then it died away, leaving only the stars. The reminder was brutal. In 100 years, Corellan would still be leading mankind towards the goal that he alone could see. But 4 months from now, another would be Secretary General. That in itself Stormgren was far from minding, but it meant that little time was left if he had ever hoped to learn what lay behind the darkened screen. Only in the last few days had he dared to admit that the Overlord's secretiveness was beginning to obsess him. Until recently, his faith in Corellan had kept him free from any doubts. But now, he thought a little warily, the protests of the Freedom League were beginning to have their effect on him. It was true that the propaganda about man's enslavement was no more than propaganda. Few people seriously believed it, or really wished for a return to the old days. Men had grown accustomed to Corellan's imperceptible rule, but they were becoming impatient to know who ruled them, and how could they be blamed. Though it was much the largest, the Freedom League was not the only of the organizations that opposed Corellan, and consequently the humans who cooperated with the overlords. The objections and policies of these groups varied enormously. Some took the religious viewpoint, while others were merely expressing a sense of inferiority. They felt with good reason, much as a cultured Indian of the 19th century must have done as he contemplated the British Raj. The invaders had brought peace and prosperity to Earth, but who knew what the cost might be? History was not reassuring. Even the most peaceable contacts between races at different cultural levels had often resulted in the obliteration of the more backward society. Nations, as well as individuals, could lose their spirit when confronted by a challenge that they could not meet, and the civilization of the overlords, veiled in mystery though it might be, was the greatest challenge man had ever faced. There was a faint click from the facsimile machine in the adjoining room, as it ejected the hourly summary sent out by the Central News. Stormgren wandered indoors and ruffled half-heartedly through the sheets. On the other side of the world, the Freedom League had inspired a not very original headline. "Is man ruled by monsters?" asked the paper, and it went on to quote, "Addressing a meeting in Madrid today, Dr. C.V. Krishnan, president of the Eastern Division of the Freedom League, said, The explanation of the overlord's behavior is quite simple. Their physical form is so alien that they did not dare show themselves to humanity. I challenge the supervisor to deny this. Stormgren threw down the sheet in disgust. Even if the charge were true, would it really matter? The idea was an old one, but it never really worried him. He did not believe that there was any biological form, however strange, which he could not accept in time and perhaps even find beautiful. The mind, not the body, was all that mattered. If only he could convince Karelin of this, the overlords might change their policy. It was certain that they could not be half as hideous as the imagination drawings had filled the papers soon after their coming to Earth. Yet it was not, Stormgren knew, entirely consideration for his successor that made him anxious to see the end of his state affairs. He was honest enough to admit that, in the final analysis, his main motive was simple: human curiosity. He had grown to know Karelin as a person, and he would never be satisfied until he had also discovered what kind of creature he might be. When Stormgren failed to arrive at his usual hour next morning, Peter van Rieberg was surprised and a little annoyed, though the Secretary General often made a number of calls before reaching his own office. He invariably left word that he was doing so. This morning, to make matters worse, there were several urgent messages for Stormgren. Van Rieberg ran half a dozen apartments, trying to locate him, and then gave up in disgust. By noon, he had become alarmed and sent a card to Stormgren's house. 10 minutes later, he was startled by the scream of a siren, and the police patrol came racing up Roosevelt Drive. The news agencies must have friends in that vehicle, for even as Van Rieberg watched the approach, the radio was telling that he was no longer merely assistant, but acting Secretary General of the United Nations. Had Van Rieberg had fewer troubles on his hands, he would have found it entertaining to study the press reactions of Stormgren's disappearance. For the past month, the world's papers had divided themselves into two sharply defined groups. The Western press, on the whole, approved of Karelin's plans to make all men citizens of the world. The Eastern countries, on the other hand, were undergoing a violent but largely synthetic spasm of national pride. Some of them had been independent for little more than a generation and felt that they had been cheated out of their gains. Criticism of the overlords was widespread and energetic. For an initial period of extreme caution, the press had quickly found that it could be as rude to Karelin as it liked and nothing would happen. Now it was excelling itself. Most of these attacks, though very vocal, were not representative of the great mass of the people. Along the frontiers that would soon be gone forever, the guards had been doubled. But the soldiers eyed each other with a still inarticulate friendliness, and the politicians and generals might storm and rave. But the silently waiting millions felt that none too soon a long and bloody chapter of human history was coming to an end. And now Stormgren had gone. No one knew where. The tumult suddenly subsided as the world realized that it had lost the only man through whom the overlords, for their own strange reasons, would speak to Earth. A paralysis seemed to descend upon press and radio commenters, but in the silence could only heard the voices of the Freedom League, anxiously protesting its annoyance. It was utterly dark when Stormgren awoke. For a moment he was too sleepy to realize how strange that was. Then a full consciousness dawned. He sat up with a start and felt for the switch beside his bed. In the darkness, his hand encountered a bare stone wall. Cold to the touch, he froze instantly, mind and body paralyzed by the impact of the unexpected. Then, scarcely believing his senses, he kneeled on the bed and began to explore with his fingertips that shockingly unfamiliar wall. He had been doing this for a moment when there was a sudden click, and the section of the darkness slid aside. He caught a glimpse of a man silhouetted against a dimly lit background. Then the door closed again and the darkness returned. It happened so swiftly that he had no chance to see anything of the room in which he was lying. An instant later, he was dazzled by the light of a powerful electric torch. The beam flickered across his face and held him steadily for a moment, then dipped to illuminate the whole bed, which he now saw nothing more than a mattress supported on rough planks. Out of the darkness, a soft voice spoke to him in excellent English. but with an accent Stormgren could not at first identify. "Ah, Mr. Secretary, I'm glad to see you are awake. I hope you feel quite all right." There was something about his last sentence that caught Stormgren's attention, so that the angry questions he had been about to ask died upon his lips. He stared back into the darkness and replied calmly, "How long have I been unconscious?" The other chuckled. "Several days. We were promised there'd be no after effects. I'm glad to see it's true." Partly to gain time, partly to test his own reaction, Stormgren swung his legs over the side of the bed. He was still wearing his nightclothes, but they were badly crumpled and seemed to have gathered considerable dirt. As he moved, he felt a slight dizziness, not enough to be unpleasant, but sufficient to convince him that he had indeed been drugged. He turned towards the light. "Where am I?" he said sharply. "Does Wainwright know about this?" "Now don't get excited," replied the shadowy figure. "We won't talk about that sort of thing just yet. I figured you're pretty hungry. Get dressed and come along for dinner." The oval light slipped across the room, and for the first time Stormgren had an idea of the dimensions. It was scarcely a room at all, for its walls seemed bare rock. Roughly smoothed into shape, he realized that he was underground, possibly at a great depth, and if he had been unconscious for several days, he might be anywhere on Earth. The torchlit illuminated a pile of clothes draped over a packing case. "This should be enough for you," said the voice from the darkness. "Laundry's rather a problem here, so we grabbed a couple of your suits and half a dozen shirts." "That," said Stormgren without humor, "was very considerate of you. We're sorry about the absence of furniture and electric light. This place is convenient in some ways, but it rather lacks amenities." "Convenient for what?" said Stormgren as he climbed into his shirt. To feel the familiar clothing beneath his fingers was strangely reassuring. "Just convenient," said the voice. "And by the way, since you're likely to spend a good deal of time together, you'd better call me Joe." "Despite your nationality," replied Stormgren, "you're Polish, aren't you? I think I can pronounce your real name. It won't be much worse than many Finnish ones." There was a slight pause, and the light flickered for an instant. "Well, I should have expected it," said Joe resignedly. "You must have plenty of practice at this sort of thing. It's useful for a man in my position. At a guess, I'd should have say you brought up in the United States, but didn't leave Poland until—" "That," said Joe firmly, "is quite enough, as you seem to have finished dressing. Thank you." The door opened as Stormgren walked towards it, feeling mildly elated by his small victory. As Joe stood aside to let him pass, he wondered if his captor was armed. Almost certainly he would be. In any case, he would have friends around. The corridor was dimly lit by oil lamps at intervals. For the first time, Stormgren could see Joe clearly. He was a man about 50, must have weighed well over 200 pounds. Everything about him was outsized, from the stained battle dress that might have come from any of a half a dozen armed forces to the startlingly large signet ring of his left hand. A man built on this scale would probably not bother to carry a gun. It should not be difficult to trace him, though Stormgren, if he ever got out of his place, he would be depressed to realize that Joe must also be perfectly well aware of this fact. The walls around them, though occasionally faced with concrete, were mostly bare rock. It was clear to Stormgren that he was in some disused mine, and he could think of a few more effective prisons. Until now, the fact of his kidnapping had failed to worry him greatly. He had felt that whatever happened, the immense resources of the overlords would soon locate and rescue him. Now he was not so sure. He had already been gone several days, and nothing had happened. There must be a limit even to Karellin's power. And if they were indeed buried in some remote continent, all the science of the overlords might be unable to trace him. There were two other men sitting at the table in the bare, dimly lit room. They looked up with interest and more than a little respect as Stormgren entered. One of them pushed across a bundle of sandwiches, which Stormgren accepted eagerly. Though he felt extremely hungry, he could have done with more interesting meal, but it was very obvious that his captors had dined no better. As he ate, he glanced quickly at the three men around him. Joe was by far the most outstanding character, and not merely in the matter of physical bulk. The others were clearly his assistants, nondescript individuals whose origin Stormgren would be able to place when he heard them talk. Some wine had been produced in a not-too-aseptic glass, and Stormgren washed down the last of his sandwiches. Feeling now more fully in command of the situation, he turned to the huge pole. "Well," he said evenly, "perhaps you'll tell me what all this is about, and just what you hope to get out of it." Joe cleared his throat. "I'd like to make one thing straight. This has nothing to do with Wainwright. He'll be as surprised as anyone." Stormgren had half expected this, though he wondered why Joe was confirming his suspicions. He had long suspected the existence of an extremist movement inside or one of the frontiers of the Freedom League. "As a matter of interest," he said, "how did you kidnap me?" He hardly expected a reply, and was somewhat taken back when the other's readiness, even eagerness, to answer. "It was all rather like a Hollywood thriller," said Joe cheerfully. "We weren't sure if Karelin kept a watch on you, so we took somewhat elaborate precautions. You were knocked out by gas in the air conditioner. That was easy. Then we carried you out to the car, no trouble at all. All this, I might say, wasn't done by any of our people. We hired professionals for the job. Karelin may get them. In fact, he's supposed to, but he'll get no wiser. When it left your house, the car drove into the long road tunnel not 1,000 meters from New York. Came out again on a schedule on the opposite end, still carrying a drugged man extraordinarily like the Secretary General. Quite a while later, a large truck loaded with metal cases emerged in the opposite direction and drove to a certain airfield, where the cases were loaded aboard a freighter, in perfectly legitimate business. I'm sure the owners of those cases would be horrified to know how we employed them. Meanwhile, the car that had actually done the job continued elaborate evasive action toward the Canadian border. Perhaps Karelin's caught it by now. I don't know or care. As you'll see, I do hope you appreciate my frankness. Our whole plan depended on one thing. We're pretty sure that Karelin can see and hear everything that happens on the surface of the earth. But unless he uses magic, not science, he can't see underneath it. So he won't know about the transfer in the tunnel, or at least not until it's too late. Naturally, we've taken a risk, but there are also one or two other safeguards I won't go into now. We may want to use them again, and it would be a pity to give them away. Joe had related the whole story with such obvious gusto that Stormgren could hardly help but smile, yet he felt very disturbed. The plan was an ingenious one, and it was quite possible that Karelin had been deceived. Stormgren was not certain even the overlords kept any form of protective surveillance over him, nor clearly was Joe. Perhaps that was why he had been so frank. He wanted to test Stormgren's reaction. Well, he would try to appear confident, whatever his real feelings might be. "You must be a lot of fools," said Stormgren scornfully, "if you think you can trick the overlords as easily as this. In any case, what conceivable good will it do?" Joe offered him a cigarette, which Stormgren refused, then lit one himself and sat on the edge of a table. There was an ominous creaking as he jumped off hastily. "Our motives," he began, "should be pretty obvious. We're found arguments useless, so we had taken other measures. There have been underground movements before, and even Karelin, whatever powers he got, won't find it easy to detail with us. We're out to fight for our independence. Don't misunderstand me. Well, there'll be nothing violent, at first anyway, but the overlords have to use human agents, and we can make it mighty uncomfortable for them. Starting with me, I suppose," thought Stormgren. He wondered if any other had given him more than a fraction of the whole story. Did they really think that these gangster methods would influence Karelin in the slightest? On the other hand, it was quite true that the well-organized resistance movement could make life very difficult, for Joe had put his fingers on one weak spot of the overlord's rule. Ultimately, the orders had to be carried out by human agents. If these were terrorized into disobedience, the whole system might collapse. It was only a faint possibility, for Stormgren felt confident that Karelin would soon find some solution. "What do you intend to do with me?" asked Stormgren at length. "Am I a hostage or what?" "Don't worry, we'll look after you. We expect visitors in a few days, and until then, we'll entertain you as well as we can." He added some words in his own language, and one of the others produced a brand new pack of cigarettes. "We've got these especially you. I read in Time the other day that you're a good poker player." Voice suddenly became grave. "I hope there's plenty of cash in your wallet," he said anxiously. "We never thought of looking after. After all, we could hardly accept checks." Quite overcome, Stormgren stared blankly at his captors. Then, as a true humor of the situation sank in his mind, it suddenly seemed to him that all the cares and worries of his office had lifted from his shoulders. From now on, it was Van Rieberg's show. Whatever happened, there was absolutely nothing he could do about it. And now these fantastic criminals were anxiously awaiting to play poker with him. Abruptly, he threw back his head and laughed, as he had not done for years. There was no doubt, thought Van Rieberg morosely, that Wainwright was telling the truth. He might have his suspicions, but he did not know who had kidnapped Stormgren, nor did he approve of kidnapping himself. Van Rieberg had a shrewd idea that, for some of the extremists in the Freedom League, he had been putting pressure on Wainwright to make him adopt a more active policy. Now they were taking matters into their own hands. The kidnapping had been beautifully organized. There were no doubt about it. Stormgren might be anywhere on Earth, and there seemed to be little hope of tracing him. Yet something must be done, Van Rieberg decided, and done quickly. Despite the jest he had often made, his real feeling towards Karelin was one of overwhelming awe. The thought of approaching the supervisor directly filled him with dismay, but there seemed no alternative. The communication sections occupied the entire top floor of the great building. Lines of fast-mile machines, some silent, some clicking busily, stretched away into the distance, though some poured endless streams of statistics, producing figures, census returns, and all the bookkeeping of a world economic system. Somewhere up in Karelin's ship must lie the equivalent of this great room. And Van Rieberg wondered, with a tingling in his spine, what shapes moved to and fro collecting messages that Earth was sending to the overlords. But today, he was not interested in these machines. Routine, busily they handled. He walked to the little private room that only Stormgren was supposed to enter. At his instructions, the lock had been forced, and the chief of communications officer was waiting there for him. "It's an extraordinary teleprinter, standard typewriter, keyboard," he was told. "There's a facsimile machine as well, if you want to send any picture or tabular information, but you said you wouldn't be needing that." Van Rieberg nodded absently. "That's all, thanks," he said. "I don't expect to be here very long. Then get the place locked up again and give me all the keys." He waited until the communication officer had left, and then he sat down at the machine. It was, he knew, very seldom used, since nearly all business between Karelin and Stormgren was dealt with their weekly meetings. Since this was something of an emergency circuit, he expected a fairly quick reply. After a moment's hesitation, he began to tap out the messages with his unpracticed fingers. The machine purred away quietly, and the words gleamed for a few seconds on a darkened screen. Then he leaned back and waited for the answer. Scarcely a minute later, the machine started to whir again. Not for the first time, Van Rieberg wondered if this supervisor ever slept. The message was brief as it was unhelpful. "No information. Leave matters entirely to your discretion. K." Rather bitterly and without satisfaction at all, Van Rieberg realized how much greatness had been thrust upon him. During the past 3 days, Stormgren had analyzed his captors with some thoroughness. Joe was the only one of any importance. The others were non-entities, a riffraff one would expect in any illegal movement to gather around itself. The ideals of the Freedom League meant nothing to them. Their only concern was earning a living with minimal of work. Joe was altogether more complex individual, though sometimes he reminded Stormgren of an overgrown baby. Their interminable poker games were punctuated with violent political arguments, and it soon became obvious to Stormgren that the big pole had never thought seriously about the causes for which he was fighting. Emotion and extreme conservatism clouded all his judgments. For his country's long struggle for independence had conditioned him so completely that he still lived in the past. He was a picturesque survival, one of those who had no use for an ordered way of life. When his type vanished, if it ever did, the world would be safer, but less interesting place. There was little doubt, as far as Stormgren was concerned, that Corellin had failed to locate him. He had tried to bluff, but his captors were unconvinced. He was fairly certain that they had been holding him here to see if Corellin would act, and now that nothing had happened, they could proceed with their plans. Stormgren was not surprised when, a few days later, Joe told him to expect visitors. For some time, the little group had shown increasing nervousness, and prisoners guessed that the leaders of the movement, having seen that the coast was clear, were at last coming to collect him. They were already waiting, gathered around a rickety table, when Joe waved him politely into the living room. Stormgren was amused to note that his jailer was now wearing, very ostentatiously, a huge pistol that he had never been in evidence before. The two thugs had vanished, and even Joe seemed somewhat restrained. Stormgren could see at once that he was now confronted by men of a much higher caliber. The group opposite him reminded him strongly of a picture that had once seen of Lenin and his associates in the first days of the Russian Revolution. There was the same intellectual force, iron determination, ruthlessness in these 6 men. Joe and his kind were harmless here, and the real brains behind the organization. With a curt nod, Stormgren moved over to the only vacant seat and tried to look self-possessed. As he approached, the elderly, thickest man on the far side of the table leaned forward and stared at him with piercing gray eyes. They made Stormgren so uncomfortable that he spoke first, something he had not intended to do. "I suppose you've come to discuss terms. What's my ransom?" He noticed that the background, something was taken down, his words in a shorthand notebook. It was very businesslike. The leader replied in a musical Welsh accent. "You could put it that way, Mr. Secretary General, but we're uninterested in information, not cash." "So that's what it is," thought Stormgren. He was a prisoner of war, and this was an interrogation. "You know what our motives are," continued the other in his softly lilting voice. "Call us a resistance movement, if you like. We believe that sooner or later the Earth will have to fight for its independence. We realize that the struggle can only be indirect methods such as sabotage, disobedience. But we kidnapped you, partly to show Corellin that we meant business, and we are well organized, but largely because you are the only man who can tell us anything of the overlords. You're a reasonable man, Mr. Stormgren. Give us your cooperation, and you can have your freedom." "Exactly what do you wish to know?" asked Stormgren, cautiously. Those extraordinary eyes seemed to search his mind in the depths. They were unlike any that Stormgren had ever seen in his life. Then the sing-song voice replied, "Do you know who or what the overlords really are?" Stormgren almost smiled. "Believe me," he said, "I'm quite as anxious as you to discover that." "Then you'll answer our questions?" "I make no promises, but I may." There was a slight sigh of relief from Joe, and a rustle of anticipation ran around the room. "You have a general idea," continued the other, "of the circumstances in which you meet Corellin, but perhaps you describe them carefully, leaving out nothing of importance." There was a harmless enough thought Stormgren. He had done it many times before, and it would give the appearance of cooperation. There were acute minds here, and perhaps they could uncover something new. They were welcome to any fresh information they could extract from him, as long as they shared it. There could be no harm Corellin in any way he did not for the moment believe. Stormgren felt in his pockets and produced a pencil and an old envelope. Sketching rapidly as he spoke, he began. "You know, of course, that a small flying machine with no obvious means of propulsion calls for me at regular intervals and takes me up to Corellin's ship. It enters the hull, and you've doubtless seen the telescopic films that have been taken of that operation. The doors open again, if you call them a door, and I go into a small room with a table, a chair, and a vision screen. The layout is something like this." He pushed the plans across to the old Welshman, but the strange eyes never turned towards it. They were fixed on Stormgren's face, and then he watched them. Something seemed to change in their depths. The room had become completely silent, but behind he heard Joe take a sudden indrawn breath. Puzzled and annoyed, Stormgren stared back at the other. As he did so, understanding slowly dawned. In his confusion, he crumpled the envelope into a ball of paper and ground it underfoot. He knew now why those gray eyes had affected him so strangely. The man opposite him was blind. Van Rieberg had made no further attempts to contact Karelin. Much of his department's work, the forwarding of this statistical information, the abstraction of the world press, and like, had continued automatically. In Paris, the lawyers were still wrangling over the proposed world constitution, but that was none of his business for the moment. It was a fortnight before the supervisor wanted a final draft. It would not be ready by then, if it was not ready by then. No doubt Karelin would take what action he thought fit. And there was still no news of Stormgren. Van Rieberg was dictating when the emergency-only telephone started to ring. He grabbed the receiver and listened. With mounting astonishment, then threw it down and rushed to the open window. In the distance, cries of amazement were rising in the streets, and traffic was slowing to a halt. It was true. Karelin's ship, that never-changing symbol of the overlords, was no longer in the sky. He'd searched the heavens as far as he could see and found no trace of it. Then suddenly it seemed as if night had swiftly fallen. Coming down from the north, its shadowed underbelly, black as a thundercloud, and the great ship was racing over the towers of New York. Involuntarily, Van Rieberg shrank away from the onrushing monster. He had always known how the huge ship of the overs really were, but it was one thing to see them far away in space, and quite another to watch them passing overhead like demon-driven clouds. In the darkness of the partial eclipse, he watched until the ship and its monstrous shadow had vanished into the south. There was no sound, not even a whisper of air, and Van Rieberg realized that, despite its apparent nearness, the ship had passed at least a kilometer above his head. Then the building shuddered as a shock wave struck it, and from somewhere came the tinkling of broken glass as a window blew inwards. In the office behind him, the telephones had started to ring, but Van Rieberg did not move. He remained leaning against the window ledge, still staring in the south, paralyzed by the presence of illimitable power. As Stormgren talked, it seemed to him that his mind was operating on two levels simultaneously. On the one hand, he was trying to defy the men who had captured him, yet on the other, he was hoping that they might help him unravel Karelin's secrets. It was a dangerous game, yet to his surprise, he was enjoying it. The blind Welshman had conducted most of the interrogation. It was fascinating to watch the agile mind, trying one opening after another, testing and rejecting all the theories that Stormgren himself had abandoned long ago. Presently, he leaned back with a sigh. "We're getting nowhere," he said resignedly. "We want more facts, and that means action, not argument." The sightless eyes seemed to stare thoughtfully at Stormgren. For a moment, he tapped nervously on the table. It was the first sign of uncertainty Stormgren hadn't noticed. Then he concluded, "I'm a little surprised, Mr. Secretary, that you've never made an effort to learn more of the overlords." "What do you suggest?" asked Stormgren coldly, trying to disguise his interest. "I've told you there's only one way in and out of the room in which I have my talks with Karelin, and that leads straight back to Earth." "It might be possible," mused the other, "to devise an instrument which could teach us something. I'm no scientist, but we can look into the matter. If you give you your freedom, would you be willing to assist us with such a plan?" "Once and for all," said Stormgren angrily, "let me make my position perfectly clear. Karelin is working for a united world, and I'll do nothing to help his enemies. What his ultimate plans may be, I do not know, but I believe they are good. What real proof have we of that? All his actions ever since his ships appeared in our skies, I defy you to mention one act in the ultimate analysis that hasn't been beneficial." Stormgren paused for a moment, letting his mind run back through the past years. Then he smiled. "If you want a single proof of the essential, how shall I put it, benevolence of the overlords, think of what cruelty towards animal orders they have made within a month of their arrival. If I had any doubts about Karelin before, that banish them, even though that order has caused me more trouble than anything else he's ever done." That was scarcely an exaggeration, Stormgren thought. The whole incident had been an extraordinary one, the first revelation of the Overlord's hatred of cruelty. That and their passion for justice and order seemed to be the dominant emotion in their lives, as far as one could judge them by their actions. And it was the only time Corellin had shown anger, or at least appearance of anger. "You may kill one another if you wish," the message had gone, "and that is a matter between you and your own laws. But if you slay, except for food or in self-defense, the beast that you share with the world with you, then you may be answerable to me." No one knew exactly how comprehensive this ban was supposed to be, or what Corellin would do to enforce it. They didn't have to wait long. Plaza de la Torres was full when the matadors and their attendants began their professional entry. Everything seemed normal. The brilliant sunlight blazed harshly in the traditional costumes. The great crowd greeted the favorites as it had done 100 times before. Yet here and there, faces were turned anxiously towards the sky, to the aloof silver shape 50 kilometers above Madrid. Then the picketers had taken up their places, and the bull had come snorting out into the arena. The skinny horse's nostrils, wide with terror, had wheeled in the sunlight as the riders forced them to meet their enemy. The first lance flashed, made contact, and at that moment came a sound that had never been heard on earth before. It was a sound of 10,000 people screaming with the pain of the same wound. 10,000 people who, they had recovered from the shock, found themselves completely unharmed. But that was the end of their bullfight, and indeed of all bullfighting, for the news spread rapidly. It was worth recording that the aficionados were so shaken that only 1 in 10 asked for his money back, and that London Daily Mirror made matters much worse by suggesting that the Spaniards adopt cricket as their new national sport. "You may be correct," the old Welshman replied. "Possibly the motives of the overlords are good, according to their standards, which may sometimes be the same as ours. But they are interlopers. We never asked them to come here and turn our world upside down, destroying ideals, yes, nations, that generations of men had fought to protect." "I come from a small nation that had to fight for its liberation," retorted Stormgren. "Yet I am for Corellin. You may annoy him, you may even delay his achievements of his aims, but it will make no difference in the end. Doubtless you are sincere in believing as you do. I can understand your fear, and the traditions and cultures of little countries will be overwhelmed when the world state arrives. But you are wrong. It is useless to cling to the past, even before the overlords come to Earth. The sovereign state was dying. They have merely hastened its end. No one can save it now, and no one should try." There was no answer. The man opposite neither moved nor spoke. He sat with his lips half open, his eyes now lifeless as well as blind. Around him the others were equally motionless, frozen in strained, unnatural attitudes. With a gasp of pure horror, Stormgren rose to his feet and backed away towards the door. As he did so, the silence was suddenly broken. "That was a nice speech, Ricky. Thank you. Now I think we can go." Stormgren spun on his heels and stared into the shadow corridor. Floating there at eye level was a small, featureless sphere. The source, no doubt, of whatever mysterious force the overlords had brought into action. It was hard to contain, but Stormgren imagined that he could hear a faint humming as a hive of bees on a drowsy summer day. "Corellin, thank God! But what have you done?" "Don't worry, they're all right. You can call it paralysis, but it's much subtler than that. They're simply living a few thousand times more slowly than normal. When we've gone, they'll never know what happened." "You'll leave them here until the police come?" "No, I have a much better plan. I'm letting them go." Stormgren felt surprised, sense of relief. He gave a last valedictory glance at the little room and its frozen occupants. Joe was standing on one foot, staring stupidly at nothing. Suddenly, Stormgren laughed and fumbled in his pockets. "Thanks for the hospitality, Joe," he said. "I think I'll leave you a souvenir." He ruffled through the scraps of paper until he found the figures he wanted. Then, on a reasonably clean sheet, he wrote carefully, Bank of Manhattan. Pay Joe the sum of $135.50. R. Stormgren. As he laid the strip of paper beside the pole, Karellin's voice inquired, Exactly what are you doing? We, Stormgrens, always pay our debts. The other two cheated, but Joe played fair. At least I never caught him cheating. He felt very gay, light-headed, and quite 40 years younger. As he walked to the door, the metal sphere moved aside to let him past. He assumed that was some kind of robot, and it explained how Karellin had been able to reach him through the unknown layers of rock overhead. Go straight ahead for 100 meters, said the sphere, speaking in Karellin's voice, then turn to the left until I give you further instructions. He strode forward eagerly, though he realized that there were no need for a hurry. The sphere remained hanging in the corridor, presumably covered him in his retreat. A moment later, he came across a second sphere, waiting for him at the branch of the corridor. You've half a kilometer to go, he said. Keep to the left until we meet again. 6 times he encountered the spheres on his way to the open. At first, he wondered if somehow the robot was managing to keep ahead of him. Then he guessed there must have been a chain of machines maintaining a complete circuit down the depths of the mine. At the entrance, a group of guards formed a piece of improbable statuary, watched over by yet another ubiquitous sphere. On the hillside a few meters away lay the little flying machines of which Stormgren had made his journeys to Karellin. He stood for a moment, blinking in the sunlight. Then he saw the ruined mining machinery around him, and beyond there a derelict railway stretching into the mountainside. Several kilometers away, a dense forest lapped at the base of the mountain, and very far off, Stormgren could see the gleam of water from a great lake. He guessed he was somewhere in South America, though it was not easy to say exactly what gave him that impression. As he climbed into the little flying machine, Stormgren had a last glimpse of the mine entrance and the men frozen around it. Then the door sealed behind him, and with a sigh of relief he sank back upon the familiar couch. For a while he waited until he recovered his breath. Then he uttered a single heartfelt syllable. Well, I'm sorry I couldn't rescue before, but you see how very important it was to wait until the leaders had gathered here. What do you mean to say? Spluttered Stormgren. What you knew where I was the whole time? If I thought... Don't be too hasty, answered Karellin. At least let me finish explaining. Very good, said Stormgren darkly. I'm listening. He was beginning to suspect that he had been no more than bait in an elaborate trap. I've had a perhaps tracer, is the best word for it, on you for some time, began Karellin. Though your late friends were correct in thinking that I couldn't follow you underground, I was able to keep track until they brought you to the mine. That transfer in the tunnel was ingenious, but when the first car ceased to react, it gave the plan away, and I soon located you again. Then it was merely a matter of waiting. I knew that once they were certain I'd lost you, the leaders would come here, and I'd be able to trap them all. But you're letting them go? Until now, said Karellin, I had no way of telling who the 2.5 billion men on this planet were, the real leaders of the organization. Now that they're located, I can trace their movements anywhere on Earth, and I can watch their actions in detail if I want to. That's far better than locking them up. If they make any moves, they'll betray their remaining comrades. They're effectively neutralized, and they know it. Your rescue will be completely inexplicable to them, for you must have vanished before their eyes. The rich laugh echoed around the tiny room. In some ways, the whole affair was a comedy, but it had a serious purpose. I'm not merely concerned with the few score of men in this organization. I have to think of the moral effects on the other groups that exist elsewhere. Stormgren was silent for a moment. He was not altogether satisfied, but he could see Karellin's point of view, and some of his anger evaporated. It's a pity to do it in my last few weeks of office, he said finally. But from now on, I'm going to have a guard on my house. Piter can be kidnapped next time. How has he managed, by the way? I've watched him carefully the last week, and have deliberately avoided helping him. On the whole, he's done very well, and he's not the man to take your place. Well, it's lucky for him, said Stormgren, still somewhat aggrieved. And by the way, have you had any word from your superiors about showing yourself to us? I'm sure now that it is the strongest argument your enemies have. Again, they told me. We'll never trust the overlords until we can see them. Carolyn sighed. No, I've heard nothing, but I know what the answer must be. Stormgrid did not press the matter. Once he might have done so, but now, for the first time, the faint shadow of a plan was beginning to take shape in his mind. The word of his interrogator passed again through his memory. Yes, perhaps an instrument could be devised. What he had refused to do under duress, he might yet attempt of his own free will.